As you know, the Exponential Center focuses on the technology innovation, the economic value creation, and social impact, and the people, companies, and communities that make that happen. So what better person could we welcome tonight than Reid Hoffman? He'll be talking about Blitzscaling, his newest book, The Lightning Fast Path to Building Massively Valuable Companies. And moderating tonight's discussion will be our own President and CHM President and CEO, Daniel Lewin. Let me introduce Daniel first. He served in a number of leadership positions here in the Valley, Sony, Apple, next to Microsoft. During his 21 years at Microsoft, he led their efforts here in the Valley with the entrepreneurial community, the venture community, and Tech for Good. He serves on the board of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, UI Labs, and StartX, as well as on the advisory board in the Department of Political Science, his alma mater of Princeton, where he received his AB. And now 5 numbers about Daniel. 1976 is the year that he came to Silicon Valley because he lost a bet. 2 is the number of times that he was recruited by Steve Jobs. 97 out of 100 is the score he received on the Microsoft leadership rating. I think the average is around 70, so that's pretty extraordinary. 9 is the number of months that he's been leading the museum here, and it's been exciting to be under his leadership with the energy and vision that he has for this institution. And 1 time around the globe is the equivalent number of miles that he swum as a competitive swimmer. Reid Hoffman, our featured speaker tonight, is an accomplished entrepreneur, executive, and investor who's played a seminal role here in the Valley in building many of today's leading consumer tech companies. In 2003, he co-founded LinkedIn. In 2009, he joined Greylock, and he serves on many boards, both for-profit as well as nonprofit. He's been very active in Tech for Good as well as in the policy arena as well. He's host of Masters of Scale, one of my favorite podcasts, an original podcast series that's award-winning, and the first in media program to commit to a full gender balance of guests. Marshall Scholar at Oxford, he also is a graduate of Stanford and Aspen Institute Crown Fellow. Before Blitzscaling, he also authored 2 other award-winning books. 5 numbers about Reid. 562 million is the number of LinkedIn members worldwide. 50-50 is the gender balance of guests on his Master of Scale podcast. 3 is the number of investments he's made at Greylock and autonomous vehicles during the past 2 years. And $100 million is the minimum addressable market that he thinks is necessary for an interesting network or platform investment. And last but not least, 4 is the number of board games he's built with his team. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Daniel and Reid.
Great
to have you here.
Great. Well, thank you, Marguerite, for your kind introductions, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I've known Reid for quite some time and had a little bit of overlap in my time at Microsoft with him. And again, perfect topic, delightful place to be having this conversation. I can't thank you enough for coming, Reid.
It's great to be here.
As Marguerite said, 1976, I've been here a long time, so, and I've met a lot of people in Silicon Valley over the years, including the likes of Andy Grove, so I'm going to be very direct with you right now. You were 9 years old when I started working here in the Valley.
Yes.
So the question I have for you,
Berkeley.
yeah, and you were living in Berkeley. So isn't this just another fad, LinkedIn? Or excuse me, not LinkedIn, Blitzscaling.
Yes,
LinkedIn's the real
you know
deal.
the answer. Although within the scales of hundreds of years, who knows? Anyway, look, I think that one of the things that makes Silicon Valley really special and interesting is it's a collective learning network. And part of what happens here is, it isn't that we don't try crazy things, and there are things that happen that are faddish, like, oh, we think that's gonna work, and like, okay, that was a mistake. But one of the things that actually happens, and it's one of those things that kind of miscounts, is that actually, in fact, in the mistakes, we also learn a bunch from. So in the first, kind of internet boom, where you saw things like Webvan or All Advantage, right? Because if you're selling dollars for 90 cents, that doesn't work at scale. And so you essentially kind of go, okay, this is broken. And they go, oh, those young kids, those people who think they're disruptors, they don't know what, we have to get back to receive wisdom. And part of what happened is people said, okay, those were mistakes, but the pattern of getting to scale really quickly, that some of these businesses, global businesses, software businesses, businesses with network effects, those really make a difference. And that path of getting to scale really quickly is actually an important part of the playbook. And so the Valley collectively learned it and refined it. And that's essentially what the reason why it comes out with the term. So I don't think it's a fad. I think it's living, it'll grow, it'll change. Tools will be added to the tool chest. Plays will be added to the playbook. But I think that the pattern of techniques that's important to kind of realize scale, global scale, very quickly, I think that's just now a permanent part of the tool chest.
Got it. So you think it's a byproduct of this evolved learning machine, which
Yes.
is the Valley. So when you explain that, do you have a sense of sort of the core experiences that you draw on when you are looking at companies that have the potential to do this? What are the building blocks of that DNA that has evolved to this thing that you think will grow?
Well, first let me start a little bit, because I think it'll be helpful for like 2 minutes to say this is what blitzscaling is,
Please.
just in case people haven't done it. So the precise definition is blitzscaling is prioritizing speed over efficiency in an environment of uncertainty. And what that means is you spend capital, you do labor practices, you do a bunch of things which are inefficient in order to get to scale quickly. That might be hiring really fast, that might be spending a lot of money, subsidizing drivers, that kind of stuff, all of that to go fast. When in an environment of uncertainty, you don't exactly know what the competitive landscape looks like. You may not actually really understand your business model. You may not understand your unit economics. You may not understand what your actual cost of customer acquisition is, what your long-term value, all the things that business schools would normally say, well, this is the things you should understand before you pour in the capital in order to scale. And the reasons why you do that is because the modern world, getting more and more connected, has more and more what I call Glengarry, Glen Ross markets, right? First prize Cadillac, second prize steak knives, third prize you're fired, right? See the movie if you haven't seen it. Most people are start responding when I say Glengarry, Glen Ross. Alec Baldwin's second best role now. His first best is SNL.
Kevin Spacey, great soundtrack too.
Yes,
actually. It's
exactly.
Really good.
And so that's what blitzscaling is. Now, what you're doing is you're adding in 2 additional costs. You're adding in a cost of inefficiency. You have to do maybe blitz capital. You maybe have to hire really fast. You're doubling the organization in 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. And you're doing it in an environment of uncertainty. Look, it's actually better if you can to actually know what your unit economics are before you're allocating the capital in order to do that. And that's actually a good thing to do. And so there's choices and reasons why you would choose to blitzscale. Now, my own first personal experience with
That's what I'd like to go to next, is exactly like what did you draw on in your execution?
So, so I, was watching, kind of what happened in 97 to kind of 99 with what was happening in the internet boom, and I was going, okay, some of these things are smart and some of these things seem to be less smart. And by the way, I'm not always right in it. I was learning from both sides. And I decided that my first startup, SocialNet, I had made a bunch of mistakes. And I now had learned a bunch about how to do consumer internet startups. And so I was planning on, helped hire a CEO in a SocialNet and hire a team. And then I was going to go and do another company. And I went to my friend, Peter Thiel, and I said, hey, I'm planning on doing a new startup. And he said, no, don't do that. Come join us. Because we're just launching our product. We think we don't have a business model, because back then they didn't have a business model. And we're going to probably have to sell this company to one of the internet giants, and you can help us do that. And so I was like, all right, fine. And he's like, you need to be here right away. You need to make the transition. You can't have time off, right? It's important to do, classic kind of, how these games play. And so when I joined, it was after PayPal had launched. We were just beginning to get the real pickup of the knee curve on eBay. And within a week or two after I joined, we were growing number of customers and number of transactions on eBay and PayPal by it varied per day, between 2 and 5% compounding. And so we had 2 customer service people in the back with an office manager who switched hit some. We, within a couple of days, went from like 0 people figuring out that are the mainline number of our Palo Alto office, which was only listed in the Palo Alto Business Directory, what that was, and dialing extensions at random. We went from a couple of days where those calls were trickling in to 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Every desk phone was ringing with an angry customer that wanted to talk to us. And so that was my first experience of this is what blitzscaling looks like.
All right. And how did you solve that problem in that moment? Was it more money? What were the ingredients that got you out of that conundrum?
So one of the things we have in the book is we have, kind of a set of counterintuitive rules, which are provocatively stated in order to try to help people grasp them. And one of them is ignore your customer, right? Which most people will be like, what are you talking about, right? And really what it is ignore your current customer in favor of your future scale customers. So ignore this 1,000 customers for the 1,000,000 customers that is coming. Because if we had done what is kind of what you might think of as classic or received business wisdom, and we had said, okay, everyone drop everything, we have a customer service emergency, everyone needs to be manning the phones, PayPal we wouldn't have gotten the scale we needed.
Stop development, everybody.
We'd just fallen over. And so we said, look, we feel badly, we want to try to do as much things as possible, we're going to have to dig ourselves out of the hole, but we're going to have to allow ourselves to go in the hole. So we turned off all the desk phones. We would occasionally, when we were talking to a job candidate, go reach over to the desk phone, which was silent because it was turned off, and picked it up and said, here, talk to an angry customer, right?
And you knew someone would be there.
And we knew someone would be there, right? Just to kind of illustrate what we're doing. We're all using our cell phones for business practice. And then we said, okay, well, in order to solve this, we need to get a major customer service center up and going and growing as fast as possible. And so someone in the office said, hey, I'm from Omaha. We have a lot of customer service out there. It has direct flights. Lots of places choose that. And at that point, the internet hadn't come to Omaha. Right. I can figure out a way to get to the mayor and governor that they will do press releases about the internet's coming to Omaha. And so they'll advertise to people to come work for us.
So you outsourced it effectively?
We built our own. We built our own using the instruments of the mayor's office and the governor's office to essentially get on to multiple weeks of the 6 o'clock news of the internet's coming, the interesting stock options, et cetera, and here's how you apply for the jobs, right? And then, and this is the kicker, because as another seasoned executive, you know how crazy this is, we'd interview people in batches of 20. So we'd have a room of 20 that we're interviewing at the same time, right? In order to figure out, and within 6 weeks we had, I think it was just shy of 200 people up and running with computer systems, telephone systems, and email systems.
Fascinating.
Right.
So what moment in this path that you've been on did you decide, what was the moment when you decided you needed to write a book about it and sort of carry on this? Because, there are so many interesting lessons learned. They are counterintuitive, and when you go through the book, I think it'd be interesting for everyone to say, what was the moment? Because there are these aha moments.
Actually, the journey to writing the book is really funny, so I'll share the slightly extended version. So in 2013, maybe it was early 2014, I was on a panel in London with a couple other Silicon Valley people, and we were asked, what's the secret of Silicon Valley? Because if you want to kind of say why that, we kind of know this, but in a short version of why it's so important is, not the tech industry, all people in Silicon Valley 3.5 million, 4 million, if you round up. Tech industry is a micro part of that. Half of the NASDAQ. Why is that? And what Silicon Valley people have historically given the answer is the 1990s answer, right? Which is lots of interesting tech entrepreneurs, move here. We have tech companies, we have venture capital, we have tech universities, and we have an entrepreneurial culture that allows for taking risks and trying things. And we have enough shots on goal that we build big, interesting companies. And that was the right answer for the 90s. But if you look at that answer now, and you say, well, we're in London, or you're in Berlin, or Stockholm, or Dubai, or Tel Aviv, or any number of other places in the world, they say, well, we have all that, and we understand the importance of entrepreneurial culture. Maybe not quite as much as Silicon Valley, maybe we don't have quite as much of the kind of immigrant, kind of founders and company starters and talent, but we have all that. So are you telling us that we just have a little bit still too little of an entrepreneurial culture, too much fear of failure? We just need to turn that dial up some. They're like, no. Because what the Valley has been doing is becoming a learning machine for actually, in fact, some of these games, it's speed to scale. It's not first mover advantage, it's first to scale advantage. And we've been learning that and how to do that and what are the things you do and what are the things you don't do and which are the risks you take. And that was the thing that was really important. So then what I did is I came back to here and I said, well, okay, that should really be, so I gave that answer on the stage. I said, that should really be written in some way so that people around the world know how to upgrade the entrepreneurial practice. Because the more places like Silicon Valley there are in the world, the better off. And so I came up with what I thought was a clever plan to do this clever plan, a little bit like Blackadder, didn't end up working out, which is I would teach a class at Stanford and I would get people like Brian Chesky and Marissa Mayer and Eric Schmidt and Jeff Weiner to all come and this class is still available online. You can find it, I think, at the Greylock website and other places. And to teach this class, and then we'd have a whole bunch of gold nuggets on the floor, and Chris Ye and I would go through and pick up the gold nuggets, we'd stitch them together, and we'd have a book.
Okay.
This was fall 2015, right? We're 2018 now. You can see that clever plan didn't really fully work out. And the reason is because while these were amazing scale entrepreneurs who I learned from in the things that they do, they hadn't really thought about, well, these were the key ones that were the differential scale unlocks. These were the things that you should talk to people about what to do. And so it's like, okay, we'll do the longer book. And then we sat down, it took multiple years of talking to people, doing a podcast with Masters of Scale,
right, which is
all of this thing in order to pull in the information in order to write the book.
So, but the moment came from that conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so some of the examples that you have in the book, like Amazon and Google, took a long time.
Yes.
These are not overnight successes. They clearly took a long time. And yet you're talking about these 18-month windows now. Why is that, and what's changed that allows for it?
So I do think that it's still, like blitzscaling, it's relative speed. Speed is always relative. And so people say, well, could you blitzscale a steel industry, or could you blitzscale other kinds of things? And the answer is yes, and as more and more of your business becomes software defined, software transforming your business, driven by new patterns of data and connectivity and everything else, then it will be closer to faster moving and more useful to use techniques of blitzscaling. Now, that being said, part of what happens is we live in a more and more connected world. We have more and more industries being software defined. We have more and more use of data and software, for example, artificial intelligence, but not just that, in order to build products and services, to turbocharge what you're doing in your business. And so that's why the time frames are getting shorter, and the time frame by which you can go from I have an idea, I'm in a garage, to I am in a one national, multinational, global in the business are compressing. And so, for example, one of the examples that we used in the book to show that it's not just Silicon Valley and it's not just pure software businesses, 18 months more pure software business, was Zara, which is fast fashion, which is what they do is they say, okay, people want to be, fashion is very timely. This is the kind of thing I'm looking for now, this season, this month. And so they use IT, right, technology, to say, okay, all the salespeople are saying, what are you looking for? What kinds of things? They're feeding that information back to the designers, who then are feeding that back to the robotic manufacturing in Spain. It's not the cheapest manufacturer, et cetera, et cetera. It's where they can actually do kind of high quality fashion, but also using robots to speed that along. And so from first signal to, oh, these are the patterns that we're seeing, to new inventory on the shelf, 6 weeks.
That's
right.
stunning. Yeah.
That's stunning.
Yeah, it is. That's quite amazing. So what's your favorite story in terms of a success story around blitzscaling? Is there one that comes to mind as your favorite?
Well, I mean, there's many great ones. I mean, we opened with Airbnb and Brian Chesky.
Right.
I mean, having learned it by all of the near-death experiences at PayPal, I also have a certain like, oh gosh, we almost died that way. Oh, we almost died that way. Oh, we almost died that way. So there's a certain affinity on the PayPal side too.
That makes sense. What about any of given the nature of the Valley and all of our interest in learning from failures, are there any that you think, from your experience and what you've studied in putting the book together, are there any that failed that you think might have succeeded, given one or two different thought processes or different approaches?
I'm probably not close enough to the failures fully to know. I mean, like, for example, there's a great movie, General Magic, that the documentary is coming out. I would look at that.
We had a nice interview with the team here. Right?
Yes, exactly. And the movie's great. You should see it. And then also the, I think that was like, it was an interesting moment because it brought a whole bunch of superstar talent with interesting patterns that later developed
in different ways. That's an interesting one. I hadn't thought about that. That does make some sense. And
right. Webvan, like really measure where your capital intensity is, and when you get to the capital intensity part of it, know what you're doing.
Not the sock puppet. Or,
Well, pets.com, right? The sock puppet. Yes.
Yeah. I was always curious about that one because my dog's really brand loyal, and
so they're looking for the sock puppet.
And the UPS truck comes by my house every day, and the telephone really removed the distance between me and the pet store. So I sort of wondered why the internet would make it easier for that model to play out.
Yes.
But I was actually in a company where the
free shipping of 20 to 50 pound bags.
20, 50 pound bags. That's no problem.
A little
exactly.
Expensive.
That one I think had some problems to start.
Yes.
Fascinating. So here we sit in a history museum that has collected both artifacts and oral histories from people going back to the beginning of this core industry. Are there any companies that you can think about from the past that you're aware of that might have considered this approach to blitzscaling?
So
just to again put a little retro hat on, because I'm a little older, as I've described.
Yes. Well, but look, the company that you were a major contributing executive to, Microsoft.
Yeah.
That's part of the reason we asked Bill to do the forward, and we're really grateful when he said yes, I'll contribute, because that was one of the very early ones. It was software based, but it was also in a time where you didn't have internet distribution and everything else. So there's a whole bunch of different things, like how do you get the platform established? What does the deal with IBM look like?
Right.
Once you have that platform, what are the ways that you evolve that platform? How do you get the whole OEM distributor system going? What are the network effects within the data files of kind of the productivity software? Like all of that stuff was like, like we all learned, early network effects. Everyone thinks network effects is like communication systems, which is true, and marketplaces, which is true. But actually, in fact, there's these subtle patterns, like, for example, between data files and productivity applications. That was one of the things that really drove Microsoft in the very early years.
Yeah, now it's funny you bring that one up, because I would agree, having spent way more than half of my business life not at Microsoft, and therefore competing with Microsoft, that their model of action in the market was, when I read your book, very much in the times blitzscaling.
Yes.
It was messy, it was aggressive.
Yep.
They moved through channel partners, they scaled rapidly, the world was their market.
Yes.
And they cared a little less about the aesthetic, but everything got done.
Yes, exactly.
Right, in the moment.
And by the way, they're a modern example of how, even when you have a big established company with Azure, how you can blitzscale within a subunit, because they can go, oh, we're really behind AWS, the cloud thing is really important, it's going to be important in the enterprises. what are the things that we do such that we get out there, we get in market, we get to scale, we start developing it, and then we later tune what are our unit economics?
Right.
What's the actual compute platform that we
Right.
make this work on, and so
In
forth.
fact, that gets into one of the questions I was going to ask, and I'll bring it up right now, which is in terms of public companies, what is the predisposition for blitzscaling, and when and how is that a prudent use with the public scrutiny and use of capital, right? The way public markets look at, so how would you go about that, or how would you encourage? Is it prudent? Is it a judicious use of public capital?
Well, so it can be a highly intelligent use of capital, and as such would be prudent. And so like one of the examples, so we already talked about how Microsoft and Azure, because Microsoft went, all right, this is going to be a super important transition in all computing. It isn't just kind of these modern consumer internet, but it's going to change how enterprises function and everything else, and we need to do our own version. We can't just be like AWS, it needs to be the Microsoft version with Azure and a hybrid model such that you can bring it on premise and you can also have it in the cloud and you can have it interfaceable. Let's start building that. That's part of how Satya kind of showed, look, I could be a really great executive. I could be wasn't doing it to be the CEO of the company, but this is a pattern, and part of, I think, why wasn't there at the time, but part of why Satya was selected as the CEO of Microsoft. Now, flip that to the other side. And one of the ways that we kind of show that companies can blitzscale is you take Amazon and you say, okay, well, in 2006 it was 20,000 employees, it was $17 billion in market cap, it had a well-established and needing to grow e-commerce business, and you'd say, well, should that should they just should they blitzscale? As a matter of fact, when they started doing AWS, there were major business magazines that had covers that said Jeff Bezos should just mind the store. Like, this is a bad idea. Like, so pressure from the public markets about like AWS, bad idea. And part of what makes Bezos a kind of a world-class CEO is he goes, no, I get it. I know what I'm doing. I actually think that there's a very good market for this. It plays in, it has synergies, the things we're doing. We're actually a tech company. We know how to do this well. And then it went and established AWS, which is obviously like the primary contributor of profits of an interesting whole new industry that Amazon is leading in terms of doing. And that was an example of a public company blitzscaling, and blitzscaling in something that wasn't their area of, it wasn't like, oh, okay, we're going to go launch India for e-commerce. It was like, no, this is a new area, and those can be exceptional uses of public company finance in order to build out public company shareholder value and social value.
Well, when you talk about the inefficiencies associated with the approach, how does one convince one's board to let go and allow for that? Obviously, it gets into the mentality, and that plays a little bit into the culture in the Valley and the process. So how do you go about that? You sit on kind of both sides. You've been the entrepreneur, you've set these things up, you've lit things on fire, and then you also are a prudent investor, right?
Yep.
So
well, some people think I'm a prudent investor.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you do okay.
Yes. So the key thing is in blitzscaling, most often you use blitz capital, which could be kind of the multiples at which your public company stock, a public company could be cash, could be revenue, or could be financing. And most often with startups, it's financing as a form of blitz capital. So you need to persuade your financiers, because you're always using that capital in order to invest heavily in getting the scale in a market before, if it's blitzscaling, before you actually know a bunch of relevant things, like what does a real competitive landscape look like, what is your cost of customer acquisition, what are your unit economics, all of those kinds of things. You're going, look, we don't know. We're building this in order to see. And so in order to do that as a public company, you need to kind of say, or any company, you need to say, I need to have the buy-in of my investors. So if it's public, I need to have, because not all investors, because it can be even a public company, if you don't like it, trade out of a stock, right? But you need to say, look, you need to have some public confidence. You need to have the confidence of your board of directors that that you're being intelligent. It isn't, yes, you're being inefficient and somewhat jumping into the unknown with your effort, but it's a smart play. And then you also have to obviously have the buy-in from your employees and from potentially your customers with the relationships of trust and everything else. And you have to manage all that while essentially, doing the wild bat swing to try to get the grand slam.
You talk a little bit about the roles that the leadership of the team has to play over time to make those things happen. How do you find financiers who are willing to go along for the ride on this? If there may be some entrepreneurs in the audience, how do you measure that, and what do you go into the conversation with as the argument, if you will?
So, first, word on the financing process. I think of the financing process as finding kind of later stage financial co-founders. It isn't they're really co-founders, but people who will go into battle with you, because almost always in these companies, there is these valley of the shadow moment where you're like, why was this a good idea? And even when you're blitzscaling, you're like, oh God, is this going to work or not?
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of stress and tension and uncertainty in doing. So you want to pick people that you're actually, in fact, going into battle with and taking all this risks and stress and this very tricky, kind of valley of the shadow moments journey. Now, so you want to find the right people and you want to ally with the right people, because if you have the wrong people, then even with the capital and everything else, it could end up very badly. Now, next thing is to persuade an investor that it's worth, taking this gamble, adding in this inefficient spend as opposed to like risk reduction mode. To do it in a face of uncertainty where there's a bunch of things, that unanswered questions while you're going into it. What you want to do is say, look, here is why this is a huge market. Here is why if we win this market, it's a hugely valuable thing to do. That's one of the reasons why network effects and other kinds of attributes of the business are part of the things that are interesting. Here's why we have a shot at it. Here's why we need to move super fast, either to get to critical mass or because of current competition or because of potential competition coming in. And here is why you can bet on us as a good bet for getting there. Those are the set of things that you're essentially going through in order to persuade an investor to say, yes, I will go on this blitzscaling journey with you. I will potentially put in a uncomfortably large amount of money, and it may not work. And that's what we're going to go do, because all of this together, if we win, we have a world transforming company,
right.
Something that either defines or defines a new category or redefines an existing category, and that is worth it.
Yeah, no, that I get, makes sense. So, how do you respond to a venture capitalist who says that he or she sees a lot of fake growth in this process, and how do you square that?
So it is like one of the things that investors learn, because it's kind of, there's both learnings from the entrepreneurs and there's learning from investors. And one of the things that can happen when you get a lot of fake growth is you can have a bunch of capital being spent on growth where actually, in fact, you have an enormously leaky bucket. You have enormous churn problems, you have other things that are masked by this, and in which case you spend all this money on growth and you have a not so interesting business at the end. Like you may have a less valuable business, like you put in $5 billion of capital and you may have a $2 billion business, right? And that would be like, oops, right? That's a $3 million loss, even though you have a $2 billion business at the end. And so, the thing that investors learn is they say, okay, well, what are the ways that we could look at this? So we could say, well, look, your growth is going really well, but does your cohort analysis, does your engagement pattern work? Even though we may not know the exact way the business model comes together, is there tunability such that there is a good likelihood that we can get to that right business? It's still a risk, but we're measuring certain things that make that risk lower in terms of doing it.
So the controls, basically.
Yes. Well, and so, for example, you can't 100% rule out fake growth, because maybe it is, maybe it's a fad, who knows? But you can try to make that a smart bet. And it's that intelligent risk, that smart bet that's part of it. Because part of the thing that happens within blitzscaling is if you have 3 companies, A, B, and C, and A is blitzscaling, and B and C are not, it's almost certain that B and C are going to lose, right? Because A is going to essentially upset the market and swamp the market. A may also lose, but B and C are going to lose. And so it's partially a, is this worth doing because it's the first prize, the Cadillac's worth it in order to make it work.
There you go. Well, clearly this is a complicated process, and so many different things have to happen simultaneously. And running a startup unto itself is a challenge, right? A startup by definition is in search of a business model, right?
Yes.
At the end of the day. And this is an exceptional way to make things happen quickly with certain conditions. So if someone's a first-timer in this process, how do they deal with it? I mean, what were your experiences joining PayPal, just as, for example, as a first? What would you say to people in the audience who have a big idea, have a concept? How do you manage those things?
So 3 things. The first, the advice I give to founders, it's in the book, the advice I give to executives, early employees, is focus on fast and strong learning. And part of the whole blitzscaling idea, we put out a framework by which there's different orders of magnitude of size of the company, ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s. The game changes as you get to each of these things, how management works, how recruiting works. Are you informal to formal process? Are you multi-threaded in the organization? When do you start doing a corp dev organization? All of that kind of stuff plays into this process, and so your learnings change. And the thing that got you here may not be the thing that gets you there, and you have to relearn, readjust your learnings. And so being a kind of a focus on learning individually and learning as a group at speed. One of the things I mentioned on my podcast is OODA loops. Your OODA loop is an individual, your OODA loop is an organization. Observe, orient, decide, act, fighter pilot terminology. That speed of adjusting and learning is really important. That's 1. 2 is build as strong a network around you as possible. So part of what I was talking about in terms of financing was it's your chance to add to your network, to bring in people that you would want you to help you learn, solve problems, et cetera. The financing option is not just capital, not just kind of an auction of what the highest price is, but to to bring in strong players in your network to help you think about how do you build the next level of executive team? How do you go to a multi-threaded organization? How do you manage certain kinds of risk? How do you raise the next money? All of that stuff is part of the financing but all around you're trying to build the strongest possible network you can. So like, for example, one of the things that I tell founders is in recruiting, don't just say, oh, I need to hire an X, so now I'm just going to hire a search firm to hire an X. In the positions that you know that you're going to be needing, always be going to your network and saying, who's the strongest person you know here? Can I go talk to them? Not, are they currently looking for a job, but if I go talk to them, they may know other people who maybe as the time gets right for going and looking for a job, you build a relationship with them, you learn what great looks like when you're a first-time entrepreneur, because that's a really key thing to knowing what great looks like as executives and all these other things. You're a first-time entrepreneur, you don't know, first time you've ever been here.
Right.
So network building is the third. And then the last is to have a really good kind of truth-telling function. A little bit, like one of the pieces of advice I give entrepreneurs is persistent flexibility. It's kind of this oxymoron. It's this kind of contradiction of both have a vision, be persistent, go through walls, and then also learn, adapt, pivot, change, right? And you're bringing those 2 things together. And part of that, what underlies that persistent flexibility is trying to have a pretty good sense of where are we really at? Is it working or not? Do we need to adjust? And that comes from your network, right? Because you're getting signals. It's not just, oh, I see it in my data, my numbers, but a set of different signals to say, okay, we need to be learning this, we need to be adjusting, we need to be readjusting so that, because like one of the things that happens with startups that go wrong is they drive the bus over the cliff because they're like, I'm being persistent, I have my vision, and I'm going to go there. And actually, in fact, you should always be learning. And so what is the best sources of truth you can get? So like, for example, one of the pieces of advice I give entrepreneurs at the early stages is don't go up to people, go to every smart person you know, don't hide it secretly, oh, my idea is my secret. Go up to every smart person you know who can give you feedback and say, here's my idea, what's wrong with it? What needs to be improved? Because you say, hey, do you like my idea? Most people say, sure, good luck.
Idea.
Yeah, it's a good idea, go for it. Because they don't want to say your baby's ugly. Like you don't bring your baby up to people and say, what do you think, my baby's cute? And they say, no, not so cute. You say, okay, how do I improve? What are the things that I need to improve or fix in order to do this? And that's the kind of always be learning.
Yeah, that makes sense. In that vein, in terms of moving down the path and you're making mistakes all the time and you're learning all the time, how unforgiving do you think the process is? And when, as you point out in the book, there are moments in time when you kind of need to get out of the way and or bring in other people. So how do people stomach that? I mean, what's your experience? How do you talk to entrepreneurs about that change process that you have to go through personally?
So part of the function of the book, there's multiple functions, but one of the functions is you think as a company you need to blitzscale, you need to be on the same page, you need to understand what's going on, so everyone can thumb through the book, they can read the book, they can get some sense of it. And one of the counterintuitive in the rules in the book is embrace chaos. And what that means is, like what I learned at PayPal when you were at, like the first journey that I was like, is I learned that I'm going to make like the speed of decision making. It ties to the OODA loop. And so what I learned is when I'm moving in, as it were, quick time, it's a fast moving thing, it's a blitzscaling battle, it's a decision. What I do is this is the following kind of decision making algorithm heuristic that I learned, which is I immediately, when I'm confronted with a decision, say, okay, if I had to make that decision right now, the gun was held to my head, I would make the following decision, right? And by the way, it makes you super uncomfortable because there's all kinds of things you don't know. Mm-hmm. You're like, these are decisions about could blow up the company or could, cause, have serious repercussions. You're like, I don't really want to be doing that.
Right.
Right. And then I go, okay, now what are the specific things that I could learn that would change that decision? Like who would I need to talk to? What specific piece of data? Not, I need to sit with it, I need to analyze it, I need to think about what are the specific things that I would do. And then do I have the time frame? Which piece of the time frame and which are the most important things to do? Mm-hmm. And could I do all of them? And what are the things in order to do in order to compact making that decision while still uncomfortable? Because you still are uncomfortable when you go through and make that decision. Mm-hmm. And so those are the kinds of things about making decisions at speed, understanding that you're taking risky decisions, you're doing things that make you uncomfortable. You may say, oh, but should I hire a CEO or not? Okay, that's am I giving up control? Is it the right thing to do? That's always risky. You always don't know how are you making that decision? How are you trying to control the risk to make it a minimal risk? Because it never goes. Look, if it goes to zero risk, it's not risky, right? And that happens, but rarely.
Right.
And so those kinds of things as ways to go through moving at speed while building these companies.
Fascinating. So there's been some criticism lately, and you're in the venture capitalist seat, just about the venture community supporting unprofitable companies with really large infusions of cash, really to focus on pressing out competition and obviously scaling and drawing in the talent. And these companies are not typically going public these days. So,
or not yet anyway.
Or not yet anyway, I guess that's right. So how do you tell the difference in those kinds of companies where they are clearly the front runner between whether it's inefficient spending or really they're on their road to being a blitzscaling company that succeeds at scale?
Well, so I was gesturing at this earlier, which is when I was talking about what we had learned from the internet boom bubble.
Right, there you go.
Which is you learn okay, does this actually have a mature state? is there a good probability that in a mature state, this is a very interesting business?
It's a real company.
It's a real company. Like, could we tune it? Like, we may not understand, like, for example, if it's Uber, we may not understand what the driver subsidies in order to get to the 3-minute average wait time. When you take the subsidies out, what is the exact, how does the market exactly work? You know, does the prices really need to go up? If the prices really go up, does that change the equation of how much utilization and usage and how many cars you have on the road and what's working? And you may not say, I don't know all that, but I think it's tunable. I think it's workable. And you go, well, it's a mission critical service. People love the service. Clearly there's a labor market that's willing to do this. It's an important redefinition of space within a city and region. Yes, okay, we'll spend the capital, we'll go do that, we'll take the bet on it. And then, by the way, then that becomes a pricing decision. They say, okay, how much risk am I willing to take about what the mature price looks like, how much capital is needed to do that, how that capital will be spent in order to get there. But then that's where, by the way, part of the reason why, you know, more often this comes from private capital sources,
right.
And this is, you know, supposedly professional investors who LPs have said, you know, have a portfolio, take risk-adjusted bets, you know, do this. And so that's the game that I think we as the Valley are learning and we as investors are learning.
So this is sort of the next phase of building on the internet,
yeah,
sort of boost side. That's fascinating, that's very helpful. Do you think there's an impact in the social sector as a result of some of these things? Because you do a lot of socially conscious work and investing as well. And because it does, you know, you see these 1 or 2 front runners, and it's kind of like the, you know, what's the number 3 car rental company, right? It was Hertz and Avis, right?
Yes.
And Avis promoted being number 2
yes.
when they were in fact number 9.
Yes.
But they promoted that they were number 2, so they were there.
Yep.
So given that there are 1 or 2, and the world is changing a little bit with international competition and
yep.
borders and barriers and data protection laws and all these other kinds of things going on, and on the global frontier where the internet sort of flattened the world, but now we're seeing barriers in and around data and yep. societal norms. What do you think is going on there?
So I'm going to answer 2 questions actually, which are very different, but I think both are interesting. So one is, you can actually blitzscale nonprofits. So like one example is Crisis Text Line. Nancy Loveland, I did a Masters of Scale episode with her as well, which was how do we get mental health services to critical mass and up in speed with a large network of volunteers, ability to service this really critical thing, which is, you know, suicide prevention, like crime prevention, other forms of self-harm prevention, and what are things to do, and how do we apply technology to it? How do we get it broadly, a broad ecosystem going out as fast as possible, both to get to critical mass for the overall system to work, but also to get up to speed to prevent as many bad things, you know, as possible. And then, you know, like you're scaling before you actually know what your cost to serve is, and other kinds of things that fit within the nonprofit arena. That's one side. So the techniques can be used in social good plays. Now the second question is, we have a chapter called Responsible Blitzscaling, which is another of our goals in doing this book was to say, well, there's this set of techniques, get them to as many areas in the world that don't understand this. And China does this, we call it the land of blitzscaling. But like other, you know, Europe and other places in the US to say, create more places like Silicon Valley. But there's another function of it, which is how do we upgrade our practice within Silicon Valley? What are the things that we're learning about which things go wrong and go badly? And so we said, well, from the very beginning, when you're at the employee stage of 1s, the family stage, 10s, the tribe stage, you know, 100s, the village stage, from the very early stage, you should start thinking about these kinds of risks. You shouldn't necessarily slow down, but you should be trying to do every reasonable thing you can to prevent these kinds of risks. So one category was like serious risk to individuals, you know, mortal risk. So, you know, I wrote an essay about, you know, the problems with Theranos on this, because the question of blood tests, super important. Misleading blood tests could lead to potentially catastrophic health outcomes. That's not the kind of thing you mess around with. Another one is a lot of impact to a lot of people. If you're doing a moderate amount of damage, like for example, it caused a whole bunch of people to lose their savings, that's a problem, right? Like you should, it may not cause them to be homeless or anything else, but you should avoid that, right, as an outcome, and you should be preventative on it. And then systemic impact, you break the system, you break the financial system, you break something else. Like those things you should say, we should pre-invest to make sure that we never get there. And part of that is to say, okay, now that next generation of blitzscaling companies, that as you begin to go into this, you say, well, we move to a multi-threaded organization, we should start hiring one person and then more people in part of the multi-threaded organization whose responsibility is to identify these kinds of risks for us proactively and try to steer in a way that we don't hit them, that we don't cause that kind of social implication. And now, some of them are just kind of challenging. Like if you're Facebook, even if I had been doing Facebook, would I have thought, oh, the Russians are going to try to hack our political system through this? Like that's not in your, that's what the intelligence services are for. I wouldn't have thought of that.
Yeah,
now,
to start.
Now the question is, okay, we've now moved to social infrastructure. What are the things we should be doing to try to make healthier social dynamics versus unhealthy social dynamics? That's the kind of thing to add in. That's the kind of thing to be responsible as you're going, and to think not only do we have individuals as customers, we have society as a customer. Now, what is the way that we think about that and proactively address that is something that essentially all blitzscaling companies should think about from their beginning through, and then add in staff to that as they're going. And now, of course, what we see happening with Facebook is they have an election integrity group. They have groups trying to work on how do we have the right kind of positive impact on society without trying to take a side in the red versus blue political dogfight, and that they're investing in that. And that's the kind of thing that you want to see.
Yeah, it's complicated for sure. Do you think, you mentioned China, the US is a large primary market, homogeneous market, wealthy market. China has scale, different regulatory regime. And when you start to think about internet infrastructure being a foundation and software-defined companies being sort of fundamentals, are there any other markets where blitzscaling would more naturally occur that are smaller, if you will? I mean, I'm trying to sort of frame a question around, okay, China's a big place.
Yep.
And has flexibility in data gathering and mining.
Yep.
The US has less regulatory oversight than the European community with the GDPR and all the stuff associated with data protection.
Yep.
And you see a world where regulation is surfacing. How's that going to affect blitzscaling, and does that put the smaller markets at a disadvantage, or entrepreneurs in smaller markets at a disadvantage if they can't enter China or don't have the ability to enter the US market?
So it definitely is the first to scale, has a bunch of learnings that then creates compounding in certain kinds of markets. So if your regulatory action or your just size of the market's much smaller, that causes challenges for companies and industries within that arena. Now, there's always competitive, that's just the size of the market, fine. Blitzscaling is always comparative speed. Now, that being said, part of what you need to think about is in globally connected world, more and more of these industries have global scope. So if you said, okay, who do I think is going to be the most likely massive and central beneficiary of the application of software and AI to medicine? It's most likely coming out of China, because they say, okay, we have a much more, kind of open and loose data policy. We're going to allow that all to be aggregated. We're going to apply software to it. We're going to accept the kinds of footfalls of, oh, we had that privacy violation, or we had that data violation, and everything else, because we want to have the industry and the end products of that. And then once we get to scale, it'll be hard to catch us, and we'll be able to develop that into a global market. That's a precise area where, part of the interesting conversation I have with European government officials is to say, look, Silicon Valley is worried about the speed of China, right? Like, we're trying to figure out what the right balances between speed and responsibility in these things. And like one of my experiences when I go around the world is in most places I go outside of Silicon Valley, I go, okay, that's a slow motion, Silicon Valley moves faster, right? That's part of the lessons in blitzscaling, moving fast. I go to China and I go, ooh, I'm learning some things about how to move fast. Like it's in terms of the speed of how it moves. And so that's part of the reason we call it the land of blitzscaling. So that's the kind of thing you have to figure out in a country, in a government, in a economic society, in a set of businesses. Well, are you planning on creating the next phase of globally relevant businesses here, and what's your plan for doing that? And look, social impact, all those things really matter. We have a chapter on responsible blitzscaling, but you have to think it's a globally competitive market. We can't just wave a wand and say, this is how it works here.
Right.
There's multiple places around the world. And so, so that's the kind of thing you have to think about, while still saying, how do we do it responsibly? How do we have the right outcome for individuals? How do we have the right outcome for society? But it's the tendency to say, look, what are the real things we need to prevent in advance, and what are the things we can fix after the fact? Because the whole notion of kind of ask for forgiveness versus ask for permission is, look, if it's like, oh, look, there's some foot faults, there's some minor damage, it's some cost, some failed businesses, that's okay.
So be it.
So be it, right? That's important. People's like fundamental health, other kinds of things. Okay, let's be more careful here.
Yeah, it makes me think a little bit about the 90s model, if you will, where the Israeli infrastructure blossomed with some government support, but it was primarily ideation and then Series A financing in the US, right? Anticipated because the market opportunity was present. So I'm curious if you think there'll be models of that ilk with entrepreneurially motivated countries or segments where they'll want to be US-centric in their scaling process, but ideation, think Skype and Estonia, and there's a number of instances. Do you see more of that occurring?
Well, and 100%. Like, take a bunch of the work that we do within autonomous vehicles here. Like, I would hope that we have a whole bunch of tech lead and currently doing autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles, we have line of sight to, is clearly going to be one of the important things coming in the whole world. It'll redefine city spaces. I actually think that while it has job transition challenges, real, and we should work on as a society, will then also create a lot of job opportunities. It's like the suburbs blossomed because of the automobile. There's all this other kinds of reconfiguration of space that could be really magical in terms of economic production and doing. Now, say for example, you have a bunch of cities and regulatory say, well, we have to have zero autonomous vehicle fatalities, and that's our standard. Well, then we're going to have to deploy in overseas markets. We'll have to deploy in Singapore. We'll have to deploy in Dubai in order to do that, and that would be a loss for the U.S. And so, so you need to hit the balance the right way, because you're going to get deaths down possibly by up to 90% with autonomous vehicles, maybe even more, but that doesn't mean zero. And so you have to hit that balance.
Right, and the insurance companies are okay with human failure, but not necessarily with robots.
Yes, and so how does that, and those are the kinds of conundrum we need to solve.
Right, those principles of sort of societal norms about what's acceptable in the physical world as digitization and software controls and robots take over of all kinds, software and hardware robots, it's going to be an interesting conversation. I've got some questions coming from the audience in the next little bit, but I want to ask a couple of more specific ones for you. And I want to ask one, you mentioned your time at Microsoft where we overlapped a little bit. With regard to the LinkedIn engagement with Microsoft, have you seen an opportunity where the techniques and the scaling and all the capabilities that you brought to bear, you and Jeff, and sort of building LinkedIn, have you seen any transition? And do you think that large companies and acquiring companies that have been part of this sort of journey, blitzscaling to scale and build these interesting businesses, do you see the transfer process as something that public companies are embracing?
Well, I think so. I mean, one of the things that was interesting is, so obviously, Satya and Jeff and I had a bunch of conversations prior to the deal coming together and then post the deal and saying how to make this work. And part of those conversations were to say, look, part of the reason why this deal makes sense is because in a sense, the core missions of the companies are friends. The core mission of Microsoft, yes, it's a huge company, a global reach, Xbox, all the rest, but it's kind of make organizations productive. Like make those organizations productive and kind of how the work works within organizations. Core mission with LinkedIn is make individuals productive. Help them in their careers, help them in their job, help them find expertise, knowledge, learning, et cetera. You say, well, those two things go together, but you need to make sure that you have both, that you don't go, okay, LinkedIn gets subsumed to the organizations, that the LinkedIn loop with trying to figure out how our unpaid member in LinkedIn is our primary customer. Yes, we get the majority of our money from organizations, but everything is rationalized against the unpaid member there. Are we keeping trust? Are we keeping happiness? The principal competitor with the LinkedIn product is the free product, right? And how does that all work out? And so we were talking about the dynamics of it. And one of the things that Satya came up with, that when he called Jeff and me and said, hey, I've got this idea, it's like, well, no one's ever done that before, especially on a huge, large acquisition, which was, he said, because typically when a larger company buys a smaller company, it puts one of the executives in the larger company charged of integrating so that you know how to get the right kind of processes, how do you balance these kinds of things, what are the things that you do in order to make that work. And so Satya said, well, let's put Jeff in charge of the integration. Let's put the CEO of the company that we're acquiring, who's going to be joining the SLT, actually, in fact, in charge of the integration and learning what are the right touch points with Microsoft and making that work across the executives. And normally, I think a few of the SLT members are like, this is crazy. Like we have all these big processes. They need to adjust to us. It needs to not be mutual adjustment. And Satya says, no, I think we're going to actually learn a lot from each other. I think this is the right way to do. And then within 2 to 3 months, like everyone went, oh my gosh, this is a genius move. It's really working. Right. And that was like one of the things that Satya invented. I literally don't think, I don't know, I'm not a business historian, but I don't think anyone, especially at scale, has ever done it that way before.
No, I think that makes sense. What you're pointing out is this learning process, and the scale at which industry is moving these days requires, a constant process of absorbing, evolving, learning, and if you don't, you fail. I think that makes sense.
Exactly.
So a couple of questions from the audience, and some of them relate to your role in the venture industry as well. And the core question here is about the characteristics of a potential CEO, someone who's investable. What are the characteristics that you look for, and what are signals and signs that say, not going to bet on this person?
So, first question is, in the domain of the market, how specifically in-depth market expertise does the CEO, do the founders need to have? So for example, you're doing an enterprise business, you'd better understand enterprise, you better understand sales, you better understand how enterprises work. Because there is a highly repeatable, professional approach to that. You may even be a specific market that you need to understand that market well. Mm-hmm. If it's a new thing, Facebook, LinkedIn, or Airbnb, you might go, well, actually, in fact, this is new, right? Yes, hospitality, travel, renting accommodation isn't new, but this is new. And so then you actually look more towards, well, do you bring the right kind of mindset, a fast, deep learning, an ability to pull the network and assets together in order to, and that's kind of a spectrum between, now you want learning all the time, but how much specific in-depth knowledge do you have? And then, do the skill sets and reflexes that you have, are those the kinds of things that will help you with this business? Mm-hmm. So that's one as kind of characteristic. And then the next thing is, do you have a plan that you've thought through in depth enough that when I as an investor or an investor is pushing you on it, you see both that persistence and flexibility. The persistence of, I've thought it through, I've really got an idea, this is why I think the right plan is, and when you're challenging it, I have answers for some of the challenges, but also flexibility. I'm thinking, I'm learning. You say, oh, if it plays out that way, then we would need to do this, or we'd need to change this, or, oh shoot, maybe I should measure this thing first as part of executing this plan. And so those kinds of things are what you're looking for. And then, of course, the ability to assemble all the resources that you need. You need to bring in investment and financiers. You need to be able to recruit employees. You may be hand-to-hand enterprise with businesses, or you may be kind of marketing and consumer. And I can make all of that sufficiently happen to go for, possibly forever, but at least the next, kind of 5-ish years and making it happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's a couple of questions that I've got still that I want to bring up about culture. Because there's so many things that you have in your past from all the accumulated experience that you have in startups and early days working at Apple after I left, and all the eWorld stuff that you worked on, et cetera. I'm curious about, in blitzscaling companies, are there particular characteristics in the culture of the leadership team that are inherent in success and or failure? And how did those translate into the broader culture of a company like Microsoft? You mentioned Satya, creating a benevolent framework which allowed for some of these things to transition. But just talk about the culture in the sense of starting a company, growing a company, and then evolving a company.
Well, so I'm hopeful that there, in addition to Satya's own good book, that there will be a set of things that will show that cultural transformation can happen at scale, and it's very possible, because Satya is really reorienting Microsoft around kind of a new kind of growth psychology mindset and a set of things, and I think it's been enormously helpful for the company, for its position, for its adaptability, for its innovation, it's a bunch of things. Now, part of the book in blitzscaling is saying which are the things that you don't have to get right, you can tune later. So like, for example, one of our counterintuitive rules is tolerate bad management. And you're like, well, that sounds like a winner. And so, and really what that is, and by the way, that's not tolerate criminal management, right? Right. That's tolerate like, oh, we don't have one-on-ones. We're not doing like, what is your career path and all the rest. It's all hands on deck. We're solving it. We're reorging. We're not communicating always the best way that we should be, because we're moving so fast and doing it. Tolerating bad management. Now, but one of the things we say get right from the beginning is culture. And part of that is to say that part of getting a culture right is we are all servants to that mission. And so I think, broadly speaking, blitzscaling companies work much better when they have a mission. That mission could be, kind of a computer on every desk and software on all that computer. It could be, kind of connecting all the world's information to your fingerprints, tips. Fingerprints, not quite the same thing.
Somebody's doing that.
Somebody may be doing that. Or making the world more open and connected. It could be any number of things.
Yeah.
Connecting talent with opportunity in the LinkedIn case.
Sure.
And so, but part of that then becomes as you back your culture up from that mission to say, we are all servants to the mission. We are all servants to that, so that anyone can hold anyone else accountable to what that culture is. And then it's important to have attributes of that, like, for example, like how is your culture really inclusive of diversity? And how are you doing that? And how are you defining that company early on in order to make that a core tenet of how you're composing the company early on, how you're growing the company, and the set of techniques that we've learned, like creating a culture deck, putting culture in your in essentially how compensation and promotion and other thing works, that we do this. Mm-hmm. And those kinds of things I think you have to do early. And I think you need to be explicit about it. And
so you're commenting, does that boil down to really framing value statements and understanding them, or is it just behaviors? Both, or
all, right? So I think it's important to define a culture explicitly. That's part of either it's a culture deck or a document. I think a culture deck says things that aren't, oh, we're all going to be excellent. We're going to be good, right? Like, that's not useful. What's the specific thing that what you're sacrificing for in order to get here? So, part of, Reid Hastings and Netflix was, we're a sports team, not a family, right? And actually, that was one of the funny things that I learned from doing the Stanford class, because I'd always thought that was a really intentional strategy, that he's going, look, he's a great builder of culture. I said, oh, we're going to do this deck. That's the way it's going to work. Well, actually, as you listen to the class, you can say, well, it started with what is the thing that we most lose people that we really like quickly from? Well, they bounce out because of culture, because they join thinking it's going to be a family. So let's write a deck, right? So that was part of the onboarding. And then like, well, we shouldn't just do onboarding. We should publish the deck so that people know before coming, oh, that's the culture I want. Oh, no, that's not the culture I want. And it's the right fit, and it's matchmaking already. And then it becomes part of the company branding. So that's how it backed up into that as a way of doing it. But that's then a lesson that we can all learn from, to say, that's a really good thing to do, to say, let's define what our explicit culture is. Let's be public about that culture. And so that's part of the branding of our company. That's part of how we operate. And you should do that from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Good. In terms of Silicon Valley, what do you think the most important issue is at the moment, if you could name one?
So I think the most important issue throughout the Valley is generally kind of what goes by the name techlash. Is going on is what is the responsibilities of technology companies. And part of that is kind of we're growing up from being kind of teenagers to major forces where, you know, these companies have the throw weight and impact that moderate-sized countries do, and so forth. And what people are partially looking for is they're looking for, don't just say, trust us, we're going to go build these great products, but talk to us about what you're doing. Talk to us about what you see going on, this impact. I don't want to just feel like I'm just experiencing it. I want to feel like you're holding trust in a good way. And I think that's a very good lesson for us to be internalizing, to say, how do we start saying, okay, great, when we go through these blitzscaling and we become, you know, communications infrastructure, or we become logistics infrastructure, or we become, you know, social infrastructure, that part of that is we're now a holder of trust. And part of that holder of trust is saying, this is who we are, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. We hear you when you say these problems. We may not be addressing those problems exactly the way you want, because, by the way, there's hundreds of millions, billions of people. But here's the pattern that we hear that we're responding to, and we're in conversation. We're being more open and transparent about the way that we see the world, about what we're doing. And some of that is learning, because you may say, look, before we weren't transparent because it was a competitive process. There were a bunch of people trying to do this. We were trying to say, hey, we're trying to get to building this surprise and delight product versus doing that. But you also say, we have to be in conversation. And I think that's the thing that it's broadly the tech industry, but obviously a lot of the tech industry is Silicon Valley companies.
Right.
And Silicon Valley companies in specific that went from a napkin idea to global impact in under a decade.
Right.
And okay, we need to be learning that. And by the way, this is one of the things that has been great being part of Microsoft.
Right.
Because Microsoft has had that global scale for decades longer, where it's like, okay, what is the right way to be interfacing with societies, interfacing with governments? What's the right way to have that dialogue? What's the right way to do that? And that's one of the things that's been, like I have learned from Brad Smith and the crew at Microsoft.
Yeah, and Brad was my last boss. He's the president of the company, and I will say, just for everyone, in compliment to what Reid just said, is the learning experience that happened at the company, because I joined after all of the DOJ activity, was one of an awakening that we're beyond adolescence, and that there's adult responsibility on global scale and a significant investment to operate above and beyond the principles of compliance, which were forced as a result of the DOJ activity, and then to change the culture, and then with Satya's leadership to figure out how to scale the business model beyond sort of the initial behaviors of just competition to how do you actually service markets on a global scale in a very, very different way. And I think that speaks well to the company's position in the market and its market cap and its opportunity.
I learn from, and we can all learn from.
Yeah, and I think everyone does learn from that. And I think, you know, your experience is in helping and changing the culture have also made a very big difference, and I know that from my friends. Before we get into the depth of the audience questions, I want to make the point that those who noticed on the way in, we have a new exhibit in the front when you walk in the building, and there's a wall that's present where we have a new exhibit which focuses on the one word of advice from people who've made a major difference in the industry in various and different ways, and Reid is certainly one of those people. So we've asked him to put his one word of advice on a card, which should be next to you there, and if I'd ask you to hold that up and explain.
Not a surprise.
Not a surprise.
Given the discussion.
And explain the story why you picked your word.
So, so part of what I have found in my own journey, because when I went to Stanford, I thought I was going to be a public intellectual, maybe a professor, went to Oxford to learn philosophy. In order to do that, I studied symbolic systems, which is artificial and cognitive science, here at Stanford, and then went into business and thought, well, I've already had all these high abstraction learnings, and I didn't realize how much I would learn in the entrepreneurial process. I mean, one of the things that Peter said at a PayPal all hands meeting, which I repeat, is in this entrepreneurial journey, I've never learned so much except for maybe between the ages of 2 and 3, right? and that process of learning how to to build these companies, how to improve the world, improve society, improve markets, create lots of jobs, transform industries. All of that process is intensely a learning process, both as individuals and a group. And so focusing on learning and focusing on what did I learn today? What did I learn this week? What did I learn this month? And that's the speed at which you're learning is, I think, really key to doing this game and doing this world transformation successfully.
Yeah, fantastic. That's great to hear. So now on to some of the more detailed questions from the audience. One of the audience members made reference to one of the statistics that Marguerite pointed out about the 50-50 ratio in your podcast of male-female ratio, if you will. Some advice on how to build culture that goes beyond what is now obviously more than in the popular press. In some cases, people are living and breathing at this quote-unquote bro culture in Silicon Valley. Yep. So what have your experiences been there, and how do you think people can learn those new lessons? You've clearly been paying attention to the topic.
So, well, first starts with awareness, and the awareness that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. You can't just say, I'm a good person, guy, bro, whatever. Probably not good bro is probably no longer in the lexicon. And
no such thing.
Yes. and say, look, if I'm not part of what's making it better, then I'm part of the problem. And so then say, okay, then what can I do and what can I contribute? And like, for example, one of the irritating things you'll hear from guys in this kind of thing is they'll say, oh, well, you know, I'm not going to then meet with one-on-one with women, or I'm not going to mentor if you're an investor, women entrepreneurs, because, oh, it's dangerous. And it's like, suck it up, right? They live in a universe that has a lot of challenges in terms of like sexist men that maybe you don't encounter, but they encounter. And so take that risk. You're like don't think, oh, I'm not going to take that risk. Say, if I am not disproportionately helping, I am part of the problem. That's true within organizations. It's true within venture and investing. And say, look, I need, hold yourself accountable. What's the way every week that I've done something to help here? Because that's the way it's going to change, is enough people getting in the field, and that's how cultures change. Because as an organization, you say, we are going to make sure that we are recruiting well. I mean, you can do the Rooney Rule, which is like every open position, unless I've interviewed diverse candidates for that position, I cannot make an offer to hire, right? I mean, there's all kinds of things that are really important, and everybody has to work on it.
Yeah, no, it's an important lesson. There's another question about, back to blitzscaling, what do you do and how do you prevent tunnel vision from sort of creating incentive to do irresponsible things in the process of blitzscaling, just growth for growth's sake, if you will, in the early days, and there's some reference to, say, and you brought it up, so I'll reinforce it from the audience about, Facebook and handling of user data, or even, say, oil or gas companies from sort of rapidly scaling, and from an environmental perspective and those kinds of things.
Well, so look, the hope is by good leadership, you, as much as possible, proactively identify not just what you're hopeful for, what you hope the world is, but what risks are. That's part of the whole responsible blitzscaling chapter. And so you kind of say, as a leader, I think about these kinds of major risks too. I go, I have this idea, I think it's going to be great, I think it's really going to work for the world, I'm going to presume that that's on the path, and then, okay, what could go wrong, and are there things I can do to try to lower, possibly dramatically lower, the probabilities that these serious things could go wrong?
Interesting.
That's a leadership question.
Yeah. Here's an interesting one. You commented a little bit earlier about the characteristics of entrepreneurs that you look for when you're investing. But this one's more specific about how do you find, and what is the quote-unquote sniff test for people who can handle the chaos? What characteristics do you look for in them, perhaps in their past, or what is the filtering that you would use for the mental agility, if you will? And maybe it ties back to your learning comment, I'm not sure.
Well, it does. I guess I'll say two things here. So one is kind of like, how does a person, like what kind of chaotic, fast-moving environments have you been in? What did you learn from those environments? And it ties to one of the things that I do as a kind of a standard part of interviewing, hiring somebody, being an investor in something, which is, I kind of ask them, like, what's an important achievement in your career, your progress? And then if you were to go call your younger self and tell yourself how to play the game differently, what would you tell your younger self? And obviously you can't give like, oh, well, no, that won't work, or don't hire, Bob, right? No, that doesn't, no, the pattern, what the learning is that adjustable pattern, the tool set. And part of what you're looking for there is, are people explicit learners? Do they think, oh, I learned something in a way that I can encapsulate into a lesson? Because not only then do I learn it, but I can share it, I can teach it. And so being an explicit learner is actually, in fact, very helpful on this stuff, and very helpful as you compose a team. And so that's one of a number of things in that.
Yeah, that's a key. When we look at the failure rate for typical startups, and if there are more audience questions, you can please pass them in, is fine. But when you look at the likelihood of success being low to begin with, and there's a filter by which a smaller number of companies have the characteristics or the market opportunity to blitzscale, what do you think the chances of success are for a blitzscale-oriented company?
Well, that's very specific, right? So it depends on the industry, number of competitors, number of things that could go wrong, which risks are you taking, which inefficiencies you need to do, which uncertainties you need to do, like all that stuff. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all. Now, what it is important is, and this is a little bit of the reinforcement to your earlier kind of fad question, which is, look, it's not cheap. It's not like, oh yeah, we should do it, it's a new thing to do.
Right.
You should do it because while it's adding expense and inefficiency, expense and capital, expense and organizational chaos, while it's adding, you're doing things before you're comfortable in terms of knowing what's kind of risks and uncertainties, but you're doing it because it's the first to scale matters here, that the prize of establishing that world transforming, that industry transforming, kind of company is worth doing, and that's why you're doing all of it. And it's very stressful, right? It is like, every time I'm with a blitzscaling company, like every week you go home going, oh, that could kill the company. Oh, that could kill the company. Like you're navigating through that and you're triaging through it. So it's a choice to do it.
It's a choice. Yeah. Okay, a couple more questions before we wrap things up. You have a strong background in symbolic systems and understanding artificial intelligence, quote unquote, and the use of machine learning to solve interesting and new problems. Talk talk a little bit about your worldview and how you think the application of machine learning against this riddle of where humans do things and where robots are going to show up. It's a very fast-moving line.
Yes.
And it is sort of this notion of, if you will.
So I'll start with one thing. So
Yeah,
people,
go.
like for example, one thing I get asked by some people, it's like, well, should we regulate robots?
Yeah.
And then this is part of the global competition thing. I say, oh, are you talking about American robots, Chinese robots, German robots, Korean robots?
They're going to be programmed differently.
Which robots are you talking about? And what that helps is that helps reset no, we want to be leading in an industry in robots. We want to be constructing robots. We know that'll create a whole bunch of transformation in jobs, whether it's autonomous vehicles, manufacturing, other kinds of things. And so we'll need to be helpful to the people whose industries and jobs are being transformed. By the way, we might be able to get robots to help with that too.
Right.
Right. So how do we align some of the solution with the problem in terms of speed and scale and so forth? Like, could we incentivize robots that help people make people more productive in certain ways versus just replacement and other kinds of things? Like, there's things you might be able to do in doing this. And so, but I think the key thing is we're not kind of sitting here as monopolists in the world. There's lots of different people working on this, and you have to be working towards building the industries and the products and services of the future if you want a healthy economy. So we need to do that, but then we also need to help with the people whose careers will be challenged or thrown out of joint by transformation, and how do we help with that as a society, and how do we make that work? And we need to do both.
And when you think about what we need to do to, quote unquote, help people, I think it's going to go back to your core word, which is learning and education and training, if you will. What do you think the challenges are, and where are they in the system? Are they at the corporate level, where the displacement may occur, earlier educational systems to teach people sort of computational thinking as opposed to computer science, because robots are going to be really good at writing code.
Yes.
We all know that because it's rule-based. And
Yes.
right. So where in the system would you apply your thinking if you were going to sort of invest in a company that was going to try and help solve this problem?
So, well, as a society, on these mission critical things, the answer is all, right? You want to kind of incent the companies to do it. You want to change the kind of educational system. You want to incent people to create online education the right way, peer and group learning so that people teach each other as ways of doing it. You want to do all of it on things that are this mission critical, that are this impactful at scale. Now, if you said you only pick one, which I think is a mistake,
Yeah.
right? I'd probably try to figure out which industries are the biggest impact, and then incent what the specific kind of paths look off from that industry. So, like, for example, one of the things that we've been doing in order to try to be helpful, social mission, within LinkedIn, is we have this LinkedIn Cities project, which is say, per city area, here are the industries that are most growing, here are the industries that are most shrinking, disrupted. So this would mean for what you would be trying to do to help people transition industries, and here's the kinds of things that you would want to make available in terms of different kinds of career paths. Here's like where this subset of skill, like here's what the skills of this person looks like. Here's this other growing one. Here's the subset that pirals. Here's the new ones you'd need. And what are the ways to do that, and try to do that in enough time that you could operate in the right kinds of time frame in order to be helpful. And that's like an example of like when you think about which ways should companies be philanthropic, it should be aligned to your mission. What are the things within our unique assets, unique skill sets, and everything else that we can be helpful? LinkedIn Cities was one of those that we could think of within our kind of LinkedIn for Good initiatives.
When you talk about that, because you brought it up, I wasn't going to probe too much on it, but what can you say about the worldview of the LinkedIn alignment with Microsoft, where there is clearly office automation is a core asset that the company has with the Office suite, if you will, and there are other ways to skin that cat, but it certainly has a large footprint. How does that relate to the integration process with LinkedIn and Microsoft? Can you talk at all about that, just for anyone?
Well, I mean, the thing that we decided was that the most important thing was to keep both companies going flywheel, and then be very like build each bridge selectively. So as opposed to trying to mash it all together, it's look at each time. So we say, okay, well, we have this transformation of productivity going in on all kinds of things. Office is one thing, but also like new factories with HoloLens and other kinds, like there's all these things. And then we say, okay, as we begin to see what those market transformations are, then could we say, all right, do we have data and information by looking at the career paths, looking at what's possible, looking at skill sets, the skill sets per job. They could say, oh, here's how you could help with business transformation when companies are saying, oh, we need to reskill these people, or we need to help them into this other industry, or we just should be doing that within our local community. What are the kinds of things that we would know from the data sets and the paths that we see at LinkedIn?
There you go. One last question before I thank you for your time and energy tonight. You've written 3 books, and you mentioned the process, sort of an aha moment and an arduous process. What's the 4th one going to be about?
Well, to some degree, there's an easy answer, which is we actually have, like the book that there's another book on the cutting room floor, and we may put that together in a more specific kind of playbook targeted specifically at entrepreneurs and people kind of building this. That's the easy answer. That's very likely to happen. We're going to check that out probably next month and say, are we going to do this? And then the other one, and this, I can only give the shortest possible answer because we're at end of time, but I actually think that we need to really rethink kind of how the board of directors mechanism works in terms of what is real governance, how does that work, what do you expect? Because the notion that you say, oh, these people this is a tiny part-time job for them over these mammoth global companies and everything else, how do you get that governance mechanism the right way? What's the expectation? What should it be delivered? How do they help the company the right way? All of that stuff is a little bit of what people are expecting and what can be delivered is challenging to deliver on, and I think that whole process needs to be upgraded.
Yeah, perhaps what you're saying is that these new multinationals are really nation states unto themselves that operate cross-border because of the nature of the internet.
Yeah, how do you have a whole
govern
company
that
in your mind of this global, and then what are the ways that you need to like change expectations or staff appropriately? Like, because you literally, for any of these companies, this is not a Microsoft company.
No, I know.
Right. For any of these companies, it could be a full-time job to be a board member.
There's
hundreds. It could be a 60 to 80 hour a week job just to be a board member.
To be paying attention and doing the right job.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your insights, and join me, please, in welcoming and thanking Reid.
Great.
Thanks so much. Great.